If you're new to our webinar series, we welcome you and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. Before we begin, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. If you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat option on your Zoom menu bar to send us a message, and we'll do our best to resolve it. You can enable an audio transcription for our webinar today by clicking on the Captions button and clicking Show Captions. A full transcript can also be enabled so that you can follow along with our presenter throughout the presentation. If you have any questions about our content today, you do not have to wait until the end. There is a Q&A option on your Zoom menu bar. Send in your questions at any point during the presentation, and we will run through as many as we can afterward. If we don't get to your question, we will get in touch with you later by email. Throughout the webinar, we'll also be sharing important resources and links in the chat for all our attendees to access. These will include other related webinars or information sources. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch on our website afterwards. You will also receive an email with the link to the recording and slides. Lastly, I encourage everyone here to take our short survey once the webinar ends. Your feedback helps us create content that matters the most to you. Now let's go ahead and get started. This presentation today will provide practical tips on how to assess for hidden traps and unexpected roadblocks that could impact the success of writing an IVDR-compliant PER, or Performance Evaluation Report. By performing a gap analysis and assessing the readiness and availability of critical resources, documents, and expertise, you will be able to anticipate and even avoid project delays and discover efficiencies that will enable the on-time completion of a successful IVDR-compliant PER. At the end of this presentation, you will know the importance of scoping your PER project in advance, the critical inputs needed to enable the success of your PER, and the impact to the project if these inputs are not available or incomplete. And lastly, how to identify those hidden gaps in resources and information, and the steps to take to mitigate them. Our presenters today are Lori Mitchell and Dr. Sarah Chavez. Lori Mitchell is founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety, and pharmacovigilance management, and regulatory reporting. Lori has provided regulatory and medical writing solutions to many pharma and medical device companies, both large and small, and she is a proven leader in designing practical strategies to meet current global regulatory challenges. Lori is also a published author and holds a Master of Nursing from UCLA. Dr. Sarah Chavez is Director of IVD and Scientific Writing Services with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a Bachelor's of Science in Biochemistry and a doctorate in Molecular and Cellular Biology, with 25 years of laboratory bench experience, and has taught at the university level for almost 20 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment, as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. Now I'd like to welcome Lori Mitchell to go ahead and get us started.
Thanks, Cheryl, and welcome everyone. Let's get started with the question, what is missing? What are you worried about? You and your team have been working and preparing for months, or has it now even been years, on IVDR transition activities. You've tackled your tech file, updated documents, installed new processes and quality systems. There have been endless cross-functional meetings held to discuss and mitigate every contingency. Surely you and your team have thought of everything, right? But my guess is it's another question that keeps you up at night. What haven't you thought of? I know there are endless ways we can tackle this topic today, But I want to frame our IVD discussion around something that we at Criterion Edge have quite a bit of experience with. Regulations such as MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4, the MDR, and preparation and writing of those required documents under MDR, especially the clinical evaluation report, which includes state-of-the-art analysis, competitor landscape, 3 separate and distinct literature searches, requiring literature screening and data extraction. All of this information and experience in the MDR world, direct relevance to the IVDR experience. And our hope and intent is that the information covered in this webinar today will be useful and instructive for those of you operating under IVDR regulation. Our team of scientists, writers, project managers know you are the subject matter expert of your device. There's no question about that. But we consider ourselves to be the subject matter experts on the report itself, the PER, the CER, and their medical device. What it takes to pull together all of the background information, the device description, conduct literature searches, reviews, and extract relevant clinical data, manage and analyze multiple data sets, and ultimately and successfully tell the story of the clinical evaluation process of the subject device. Again, we're talking about medical device here. This process is no different for the development of the PER. That's important. So I know I'm going to be talking in medical device language much of during this webinar, but really from the regulations and the process, it really will be the same and already is. We've already written IVDR documents. It is the same under IVDR. So I often say the CER, which is of course the equivalent in IVD land to the PER. The CER has one job. It just has one job. It must present sufficient evidence that demonstrates the safety and performance as intended of the medical device under evaluation. It's virtually the same language for the PER as well. Performance is not really an issue in IVD. It has to do more with detection and efficacy, but the concepts are the same. And this is a pretty straightforward statement of intent. And with only a few wording changes, you can apply, like I said, this same measure to the success of your PER. Yet we all know the evaluation process of either an in vitro device or a medical device is incredibly complex and full of unexpected and sometimes unwelcome surprises. That's what we're going to talk about today. Some of those surprises that maybe you haven't thought of as yet as you prepare to write a PER. And we're going to come from the position of that these surprises are known to us. It's based on our extensive experience with MedDev Rev 4, the MDR regulations, and the CER. I present to you the analogy of the PER as a Jenga tower. I think most of us might be aware of this tabletop game. A Jenga tower is assembled from many parts, and when properly built, it must stand on its own. But of course, like the Jenga tower, a PER can only be as strong and stable as its weakest part, and could ultimately fail to effectively demonstrate analytical and clinical performance if information is missing or not properly developed or presented. My suggestion is for us to start today by borrowing a page from MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4, that regulation which tells us that the first step in the clinical evaluation process is scoping. Of course, at that time, MedDev Rev 4 was referring to the clinical evaluation process in the medical device industry. When IVDR was subsequently published, those IVDR regulations referred us back to MedDev Rev 4 for guidance on some specific details. So here I'm not talking about scoping at the macro level, the department level within your organization. You must approach this exercise of scoping where you are at the project level. You have a job to do. It's writing, let's just say a PER or any other document, an SVR, a CPR. That approach this exercise through the point of view of at the project. And in this case, the PER itself. Therefore, ask yourself, what inputs are needed to write that document, the PER? When are they needed by? And finally, will they be ready on time? That's a hard question sometimes to answer because it's not always you that are in charge of that timeline. Could be your colleagues in a technical area or in all kinds of other departments. But you have to ask the question. So approach these scoping questions a bit as it's as if it were a gap analysis exercise. Begin by identifying and assessing the critical elements needed to support the performance evaluation process. For example, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these are pretty important concepts. What is your regulatory strategy? How will you drive this through to the PER? Is it final? Is it still under discussion? Are you sure that you know the regulatory strategy? Have decisions been made with respect to device grouping or device families within one PER? This is a pivotal decision that must be finalized early, certainly before a PER could ever be started. Another one, next, what is the status of all necessary inputs to the PER? We already alluded to that. The data, let's start there. All clinical data sources, such as performance analysis data, which might not be very clinical, but it is data derived from PMS activities, if available, and most importantly, the systematic literature review of clinical and analytical data. All those data must be available or in the process of being available very shortly. Another question to ask is from a necessary input is, are critical input documents that are needed early in the PER process, such as the IFU, are they finalized or are they still being revved? These kinds of documents that are fundamental to the structure of the PER, it could create serious timeline issues downstream if they are in the process of being revved during the process that you're supposed to be writing the PER. That should really be solid by the time you get started or very shortly thereafter. And speaking of timelines, we as writers, we always ask about timelines. What is your timeline? Are they firmly established? So ask yourself the same question. What are your timelines? Are they firmly established? Have you allowed for enough time to finish the PER or built-in time into your cadence to mitigate unexpected changes or roadblocks? I can't emphasize time enough, and we're going to talk about it later. I'll leave you with this comment. Time can either be your best friend or your worst enemy in this case. Additionally, assess your available resources. For example, do you have access to solid, reliable IVDR document templates? Do you know what goes into a PER, an SVR, APR, CPR, or the plans, the PMS data report or the plan? These are important. If you don't have that kind of document roadmap in the form of a template, then that's going to be difficult to navigate a document that you really don't know what it's supposed to contain or what it's going to look like. If you do have those templates, that's great. But ask yourself this: how confident are you that they're IVDR compliant? How confident? In other words, will they pass the pressure test subjected by a notified body review? Now, I would like to say this as well. None of us really know that yet. There are very, very few instances out in the entire industry where the notified bodies have given feedback. We write a lot of these documents for our clients. We haven't yet seen IVDR notified body feedback on any kind of an IVDR document, submitted document yet. I'm aware of just a couple of other people that have said, yeah, we got something back, but you know, these are friends of mine in the industry. We as Criterion Edge have not worked with a client that's gotten IVDR feedback yet from the notified body. So another question, do you have access to expertise? And I mean writing expertise. I don't mean expertise now with relationship to your analyte or assay or the device itself. I'm talking about the writing of these very complex reports. I can tell you from experience of our team fixing many poorly written CERs, that writing an IVDR-compliant PER is certainly not a job that's best left to the uninitiated. It is a very complex document. And by the way, the PER requires an extensive focus on the systematic literature review process, which we'll be talking a little bit more about. The search, review, and screening of clinical literature retrieved through a robust literature search that is not, by the way, performed, this is not an internet search. This is not a PubMed search on the internet. It's just not. That's not IVDR compliant. Do you have access to that specialized expertise? And finally, I talked about a little bit about your available resources and time. But finally, is there bandwidth? Do a critical assessment of the bandwidth within your organization. Do you have enough access to human power with the availability to do the job of compiling these documents, performing the literature searches, screen and selection, writing, review, QC, which in the case of a PER will surely be a document that's well in excess of 250 or 300 pages long. They're that long. So I'd like to now, after I've given you all this doom and gloom and things to think about, let's hand it over to Sarah and she'll kind of walk you through some of the details. Sarah?
Hi, thanks, Lori. So what Lori has already alluded to, this emphasis on organization and having all of the pieces together is really the major feedback that we are hearing from notified bodies as they present at various conferences. For the most part, the two main aspects that they are noting in early submitters under the IVDR are a complete lack of organization or inconsistencies across documents, as well as a lack of data. And the lack of data is something we all were anticipating. That lack of organization, I think, just reflects the fact that a lot of us are not as familiar with what is expected of each of these documents. So here we've built a graphic to help point out some of the key inputs that are necessary as you begin the process of writing your PER. So as you can see, a fully developed PER is actually built upon many individual elements, and they must be aligned to ensure consistency across each of these separate documents. So I'd like to point out a few key aspects of some of these. First off, this analytical and clinical performance data. Very early in the process, expect to conduct an early and honest assessment of the sufficiency of your clinical data. That's really the first key undertaking that your team should embark on. If you don't have clinical data, you should be prepared to develop a plan to acquire clinical data. And that's where many people are finding themselves. The development of the analytical and clinical performance measure criteria. These are the performance objectives that are required, and it's a mandatory early step that you should be conducting at the beginning of your PER planning process. The state-of-the-art section and the clinical literature section and screening are 100% dependent upon having very well developed and finalized performance objectives to ensure you haven't missed anything. And the risk-benefit analyses, these are also a critical component that helps the PER writer really tie everything together as part of that conclusion and your final analysis. And in this case, the risk is related to the risk of an incorrect test result, as opposed to in the medical device world, where we're used to more of a direct risk to health. In this case, the risk is indirect, but it's still a risk. And we must assess whether or not we have mitigated the risk of a false result through our analysis. And then finally, these supporting reports. These are really the black box here for many of us. Because in the medical device world, these separate reports are not a requirement. And so the supporting reports are built upon extensive literature searches and many other supporting documents that are going to separate the data into the data that supports the scientific validity of your approach, and the association of that analyte with the clinical condition or physiological state. It'll be your technical documents that are helping you to develop the analytical performance, but it also consists of method comparison analyses that have been published in the literature, which describe the analytical performance of your assay compared to alternatives or competitors. And then finally, the clinical performance report. And that's really where we're seeing some deficiencies in terms of the amount of clinical data available. So really, this entire process can be daunting if you're building these individual reports from scratch. So developing well-designed templates really helps you keep on track and also makes it easy to edit because you know where the information is carried through across each of these different documents. The template is critical for keeping you organized and when writing your initial first attempt at a PER, but it also helps to provide that roadmap that you need for future updates of the PER, because this is a performance evaluation report. It's a one-time document, but the performance evaluation is an ongoing process. The writing process will involve many writers and contributors from different departments. So having an organized and a strategic approach to your PER and your templates will help you ensure that your specific IVD is going to have a successful attempt at this first go with the IVDR. So we've covered many of these topics in our previous webinars, but in today's presentation, we thought it would help to focus on the 4 elements. First, the tech file readiness, which will go into some of that analytical performance data and some of the data that you have in-house ready to go. The document templates, which, as I've alluded to, organization is key, and it can save you quite a bit of time if you know what information needs to go into each of these individual documents. The systematic literature review, which again, we've spoken about at length in some previous webinars, but this is such a critical step. And it's also an area that early notified body feedback is pointing out as a clear deficiency in many submissions. And then finally, we'll end with that discussion of bandwidth and writing expertise. So first up, let's talk about the tech file. Are there any outstanding documents that you are waiting from your R&D team? In some cases, we've even noticed that people are beginning this process as the device is still currently under development. So it's important to ask yourself, are the files that I have and the documents that I'm using finalized, or are we still awaiting pending decisions? So, when you're thinking about the critical documents within your typical tech file, they're going to have a direct impact on PER development if they aren't ready. And here are a few of the major examples. First off, the PER is built on the IFU, your indications for use. Having a very clear intended purpose statement is absolutely critical because the IFU will literally touch on every part of the PER. It's critical that you are able to support any and all indications that you are claiming. If your intended purpose has plenty of data, if you have multiple intended purposes and you have plenty of data for one, but you're a little bit lacking for another, that's a discussion to have with your regulatory team. Especially for legacy devices, we've noticed many legacy devices, the intended purpose is not always the same as what it was when it was originally developed. You may be state of the art for some indications, but not all of the indications. Better options may have come along since your device has been on the market, if it's been out there for 50 plus years. So really, if your IFU is still under review or possibly needing updates during your PER writing process, you need to build in that extra time for the writers, because if you change the IFU midstream, you are going to also need to potentially change your systematic literature reviews and many other places within these supporting documents. It really is a writer's worst nightmare when the client comes back and says, oh, we've actually added an indication or removed an indication, because it does mean that you're going to have to go through and make some pretty significant changes in each of these documents. Next, your PMS and PF plans or other reports. And I mention these because for several reasons. First off, many times in the medical device world and also in the IVD space, these documents tend to be underdeveloped, or in sometimes they're missing altogether, such as your PMPF plan. And sometimes they just need sort of this overhaul. You know, you need to kind of start at the beginning. We tend to receive much of the PMS data in a raw form, and it essentially consists of these huge spreadsheets that require an enormous number of hours to compile the data into PER-ready tables. But remember, your PMS data is a really valuable source of clinical data on the safety and performance of your IVD, that risk of your IVD. So it's not something you should take lightly because as we all know, clinical data is hard to come by for many devices. The data set should be weighted and appraised just like all other clinical data sources, which are things like your clinical investigation data or data that you've established through the systematic literature review. And then next, we have those clinical data, those clinical investigation data. Are those finalized, or are you actually waiting on some of these studies to be completed so that you can obtain the final data? That definitely impacts your timelines. So build that in as you're planning. The non-clinical data is actually often overlooked, and it can be a source of project delays. So think about whether or not you need to undergo some additional design validations. For many devices that are going in under the IVDR for the first time and our legacy device, they're actually noticing for the first time that they may not be state of the art and their design may need additional validations or tweaks to it. So that can also lead to some potentially unanticipated project delays. And finally, ask yourself if there are critical internal decisions that are outstanding, like for instance, whether or not you're going to have a change in product lines or device families or groupings. And those can affect the PER development and your timelines. Some of these decisions could involve things like labeling that may not have a direct impact on the PER. And those types of decisions can actually be reached in parallel with your PER writing. So they're not necessarily rate limiting. But some of these more foundational strategy changes, like adding an indication at the last minute, can certainly impact the quality of the PER as well as the literature review that you're expected to conduct. So I wanted to explain just sort of a perfect cause-effect scenario. So suppose you have a device that's been on the market for quite a while, and as you run your systematic literature review and you start to identify data that's going to help you support that your device is state-of-the-art, you realize that all of your competitors, let's say you're a PCR test for identifying a particular infectious agent. If all of the competitors that you're identifying actually use a different methodology that is more sensitive or eliminates some of that risk of a false positive or a false negative, that can lead to your device actually having to undergo a fundamental change. You may have to go back to the drawing board because and we've had this happen where the state-of-the-art section and that SVR development leads to direct changes in the device itself, in the actual functioning of the device. You may have to add primer sets to your PCR test. That happens. And that's really the purpose behind these regulations, is to ensure that what you're putting out on the market is state of the art. So, because of these potential changes for indications, it may be necessary that you have these discussions very early on. So think about really the global impact of the PER. You have to understand how the state of the art and that data analysis and all of your devices data, how do they all merge together to tell a complete story? So if you wind up changing groupings, or if you wind up changing the IFU and the intended purpose, all of that could potentially lead to your device being changed in such a fundamental way that now the PER needs to be completely scrapped and started over. So now I'd like to hand it off to Lori so that we can discuss basically that important aspect of those templates, which is a question we get quite a bit.
Sorry, everyone, I was muted while Sarah was chatting. And thanks, Sarah. Boy, do we get questions about templates all the time. And first of all, I want to recognize that, again, that it's fairly early in the process of developing solid templates, very well designed for IVDR regulations, and most importantly, ones that have been undergone notified body scrutiny. So all we can go on right now are the regulations themselves and experience in the medical device world, because again, much of the concepts are the same. And those notified bodies, the notified bodies are certainly, they're all talking to each other, and they all sort of know what the regulations are and what it is they're looking at and looking for. So let me just skip that slide. There we are. So think of a good template as the roadmap. And Sarah talked about that. It's a roadmap. It provides guidance. It tends to keep the writer and the process on track and honest, if you will. It's hard to go off into the weeds if you are following a solid template. It creates efficiencies and through standardization. So a solid template is really a great thing to have. And it will help to ensure that your document, is ushered across the IVDR finish line. That's what we hope for. So, but have you given much thought to the importance or impact of these templates? Many people, I would say, focus on the PER template, but remember, there are multiple documents that you need to push across that finish line. The SVR, the APR, the CPR, and the PMS and the PMPF plans. So all of those you should consider developing additional templates for those documents as well. If you do not have, for example, the PER template developed, does it guide that? Does the template that you're using or the process that you're using, does it guide that story process that I keep referring to? If you sat down and read, for example, a good template should do this. If you sat down and read just the template, would it still make sense and flow logically? That's a great test of a template. Can you understand what it is you're supposed to do based upon reading through the template itself? A template should start at the beginning by setting the stage with the state of the art. And this is a template for now. I'm talking about a template for a PER. So a PER template should start at the beginning by setting the stage with the state of the art. The state of the art conversation under IVDR arises out of the SVR, which is another report. Whereas in medical device, the state-of-the-art section is embedded within the CER and is not its own standalone report. But that's not true in vitro device. There's a separate scientific validity report, which is very, very analogous to the state-of-the-art section in a CER under MDR. And then from that beginning, the story flows from there. The PER should culminate in, the big finale, which is the conclusion where you tell the reviewer that yes, indeed, this PER, this report has demonstrated that your IVD does perform as intended and the risks of false test results have been mitigated. Thus, your IVD will meet all IVDR requirements for analytical, clinical performance, scientific validity, as well as risk. That's the PER. That's the job of the PER. Does your PER template include all IVDR required elements? One great advantage would be if your template has already been, as I've already referenced, pressure tested by having gone through notified body review. But that's still rare. And because IVD is new to everyone right now, for most of us, it's really just hypothetical that it would pass notified body scrutiny. That doesn't sound very comforting. So that's why we take our lessons and derive our lessons from the MDR experience, which is now several years old. And having that experience in the MDR world and CER preparations is extremely helpful as you develop these templates, because there are lessons learned there. Proceed with caution, developing your template. Do your due diligence by carefully assessing the templates for all required IVDR elements. And then ask yourself questions such as, does this template flow? The question of, if I read just the template alone, would I understand the progression? Is it logical? Does it tell a story? So why do I keep emphasizing this point of logical, easy to read, and an understandable PER? And this is an image I'll leave you with regards to that. I suggest that you keep this image in your mind. You should assume that the notified body reviewers who are going to review this PER, they are overworked. You might giggle a little bit. I always do when I say this, but it's true. They're likely overworked. They're likely tired. They're distracted, possibly hungry and sleep deprived. When they come and when it's time for them to review your document, make it easy on them. A PER, if they have to work hard at reviewing and combing through your PER because it's poorly written, it's disorganized or disjointed, it's underdeveloped, it's missing key information, it doesn't flow and tell the story, they might get even more cranky. And we've seen this happen in the medical device world, but they just sort of like give up, like, I can't tell what's going on here. And then they start pinging on everything. And they begin to distrust the entire document and its content. Needless to say, that's a tough place to find yourself in with your notified body reviewer. And you would want to avoid that scenario at all costs if you can. A great template can help keep that from happening. So again, a solid, comprehensive report template aligned with IVDR requirements. And better yet, as time goes on, one that has been pressure tested and usually revised because of those pressure testing notified body feedback, it's worth its weight in gold. However, again, remembering the flip side, that if you rely on templates that you've developed that are yet untested, poorly constructed, that can create, and if you rely on them, you're kind of hanging your hat on those, that can create downstream delays, cost overruns, to fix poorly written PERs, and perhaps worst of all, costly delays in your IVD approval for critical devices within your product portfolio. So that's my lesson on templates. They are your best friend or could be your worst enemy. So, and they will always be revised. We are in a learning process. The MDR templates that we wrote for a CER in 2017 bear sometimes little resemblance to a CER template here in 2023. The kind of the bones are there, but they're much more well developed. It will be the same for IVDR, except IVDR has the advantage of kind of being following behind the MDR experience, which is a good thing for in vitro devices. So Sarah, that is the end of my discussion about templates. Looking forward to people's questions, and back to you.
Yes. So when it comes to your templates, a lot of the information that you're developing to put into these documents is derived from systematic literature review. So we always like to emphasize this step, and we want to ensure that people feel comfortable that they have the resources and the expertise to actually tackle this process. So in essence, systematic literature review is something that scientists have been doing all along. It's a very clear, methodologically sound plan to identify, retrieve, select, appraise, and weight published data. So this whole process is really nothing new. It's a gold standard process for all evidence-based research in academia and professional areas. So the same principles that we've been expected to use as you're developing a systematic literature review for publication are now being mandated by the global regulatory authorities. And they're being adopted by the pharmaceutical, medical device, and now the IVD manufacturers as best practice. So as you're assessing your ability to perform an IVDR mandated SLR, ask yourself if you have access to a librarian who can help you develop a robust search strategy using mesh search syntax and keywords. Then ask yourself, do you actually have a platform to organize all of these searches, including not only the search protocols, but also the results of each of these searches? The whole purpose behind a systematic literature review is that it's reproducible and it's well documented. So these searches are not just internet searches. So that will not accomplish the same level of complexity that you engage with if you're using things like and or mesh search strings. And then the minimally expected databases for these types of searches in the MDR space have always been Embase and Medline. That is the bare minimum. PubMed searches have traditionally not been accepted as a standalone search. So be expected that you're going to be searching a minimum of Embase and Medline. And then finally, when you get these search results, depending on your actual topic area that you're searching, these are 3 separate standalone searches. You'll have a state-of-the-art search, a guideline search, and a competitor device search, as well as actually a subject device search. So in essence, you really have multiple independent standalone systematic literature reviews that should be documented and screened independently using appropriate inclusion and exclusion criteria. That takes quite a bit of time and organization. So ask yourself if you have the bandwidth to pull people away to screen 1,000+ articles over the course of several weeks. And in our experience, a typical turnaround time for a clinical literature search preparation, which encompasses conducting multiple searches to support the SVR and a separate search to support your CPR, as well as all of the screening of those references returned, can easily be 4 to 6 weeks, start to finish. So build that into your project plan and ask yourself if you have enough bandwidth to pull away resources to devote to properly screening and documenting this entire process. And here I will pass it off to Lori to describe a little bit of basically how having the right people in the right places can help you speed up this process, who to pull in to help you with each one of these steps.
Yeah, you bet, Sarah. Thank you. Expertise is the word right now, or more to the point, in some cases, the lack of expertise to do the work can derail even the best plans and preparation. Let's talk more about that. To make a good project work, I think we might all be familiar with this analogy, a few years old now, taken from that Good to Great book by Jim Collins. Get the right people on your team and put them on the right seat, in the right seat on the bus. Your internal team are all subject matter experts on the device, and thus the document, data, and information needed to write the clinical and analytical performance reports and the scientific validity report. Each person has their specific role to play in their specific specialty, be it regulatory affairs, clinical affairs, quality, research and development, etc. But who among your team are the right people to be assigned to the task of preparing, supporting, and pushing along these reports and ultimately the PER to completion? In other words, I just listed a lot of great internal resources, reg affairs, clinical, quality, and so forth. But who among them are the writers? The ones that are going to pull all this disparate information together and tell the story from beginning to end. That's the point. I'm kind of making the point here, which leads to the, again, borrowing from the analogy in the book. Let's assume you have great people, but are they each sitting on the right seat in the bus? Are their skills and talents deployed effectively to the correct task? For example, Sally is a great scientist, very knowledgeable on the device and a great analytical thinker. But does she have the right skills to effectively lead the PER team? John is very experienced in reg affairs, and his guidance and leadership in this area is invaluable. Maybe he seems to be the best fit to compile the PER, and he might have the bandwidth to take on the task. But can he write? Does he really understand the task? Can he analyze data? And there's the skill that's often overlooked. Is he an expert in, and here's the skill, I should say, that's often overlooked. Is he an expert in using Word? Because the complexities of an IVDR-compliant PER require some pretty advanced word skills on the part of the writer. This is the time to honestly assess the resources you have on hand, identify the gaps, and find ways to fill those gaps in advance. Select the right people, put them in the right seat, and where gaps exist, whether it's bandwidth or expertise, act early to fill those gaps. And my final point here is that it takes a village to pull together a successful, well-written IVDR-compliant PER. Partnerships are critical to the success of any task, but certainly to one as monumental as the PER, they're even more critical. Partner with your internal, cross-functional colleagues across departments. Form partnerships within your own team, and partner with a great external resource such as a consultant or a vendor if needed. Great partnerships are greater than the sum of their parts and can lead to great outcomes. Lastly, I'll leave you with this thought about time, which is the master of us all, and I think I alluded to that earlier. I thought I'd wrap up this session with time, since we're sort of running out of time, talking about time. There are two measures of time represented here in this little graphic. On the left, the number of calendar days remaining to the final project due date. On the right, a representation of the days, hours, minutes needed to complete a task. When a certain deliverable is coming due, I always assess the time remaining from these 2 points of view. How many hours are needed to complete the work, and how many calendar days do we have to do it? So before we move to our Q&A session, I'll leave you with these humble bits of advice from Criterion Edge. If you think a certain PER writing task will take 1 month to complete, double that. If you're sure that everything will be ready for the PER project to start on November 1st, plan to start on November 15th or even later. My final advice for preparing for any PER project is straightforward. Do not underestimate the importance and need for time. Thanks everyone for your time and attention today. I'm really looking forward to your questions. Now back to Cheryl.
Thank you, Lori. We do hope that you've gained a solid understanding of how to assess your PER project for roadblocks and delays using this gap analysis approach, which inputs have the greatest impact on the success of your PER, how still evolving decisions and incomplete documents can negatively impact your PER quality and timelines, and of course, why early intervention and mitigation of these unexpected issues can help ensure the success of the project. As we move forward, we're going to turn to our Q&A portion for the remainder of our time together here. We've reviewed the questions we received from many of you beforehand. And that said, we encourage you to still send in any additional questions now through the Q&A Zoom button on your screen, and we'll run through as many as we can in our remaining time. While your questions are coming in, I want to remind you all that you can reach out to us at consult@criterionedge.com to schedule some time to talk with our specialists, and you can also book a meeting time with us through the link in the chat. Now we'll go ahead and get started with this first question. What are the key points in the PER, Sarah? How would you summarize that?
So really think about it as far as the overall persuasive argument you want to make to the notified body. You need to show that your device can perform as intended. So you need to show clinical data and analytical performance data. That's where the APR and the CPR comes in. So you want to show that your device, if used under perfect, like controlled laboratory settings, works as intended. It's technically accurate. That's analytical performance. Clinical performance is when that device gets taken out into the real world and there are other users. Does it still work? Or are there circumstances or locations or environments where it's not as accurate? So that's the clinical data. But you have to tie all of that together and support it with the state of the art. And really, that's why we think the scientific validity report is so important in this case. It's because the scientific validity shows the association of what you're looking for with the diseases you're claiming you're indicated for diagnosing. So are you looking for the right analyte to make that particular assertion? Are there better options out there? So you have to justify not only the science that drew you to know that what you're looking for is the correct thing to be identifying to make that diagnosis, but you also want to know all of your alternatives. If your test wasn't available, what else could be done? Is your test the benchmark and the gold standard, or is it a new test on the market? That's going to impact the approach that you're going to take to making this argument. And it could be that your device is being sort of overtaken in the market by some newer tests that maybe are easier or are point of care, and that's a benefit. But you need to think about maybe what are my benefits? What is the risk associated with a false result from my test? And are there benefits to using my test compared to other alternatives out there?
Thank you, Sarah. Our next question for you comes from Soumya, who asks, what is the most efficient way to tackle writing the PER? And what are some documents we should have in our hands right off the bat?
So I think this goes back to scoping. When you're starting out, the first thing you want to ask, when we get a new project, we look at the IFU. What are your indications for use? What is your intended purpose? You need to build everything off of that. That's your foundation. So that will tell you your PICO terms, your population that you are indicated for, your indications. Can you diagnose multiple conditions or states? The comparators, what are all of those alternatives out there for making the same diagnosis? And then your outcomes, those are your performance objectives, and those are analytical performance and clinical performance. And in some cases, there may be very project-specific performance objectives that you want to ensure you are aligning. This is incredibly important if you are conducting clinical studies of your own. By doing a quick assessment of how your competitors assess performance will help you know what types of data to collect. Are you limiting yourself to sensitivity or specificity, or if your device is intended to be more of a predictive value, it can predict disease risk. Are you using it for screening, or are you using it for diagnosis? Those are all the language and the terms that you need to be very clear on up front, because that's going to help you establish the scope of your document. So I would say number one, intended purpose. That really is what you're going to build everything off of. Then look at what in-house data you have access to, and then very carefully define the limits of your systematic literature review and dive right in and try to see what types of data are available. You may get lucky and have some published data out there that's going to help you support yourself, but you may find that there are some pretty clear gaps, and that could result in you revising your intended purpose.
Thank you, Sarah. We're going to move past the next question. We've already answered that earlier, so we will go ahead and head to the next slide. How important is the PER for legacy devices, Sarah?
This, I think, is something that a lot of people overlook. Really, when you think about a legacy device, we get asked this all the time. My device has been on the market for 50 years. Why do I have to do this? No one questions that you can, it's a very common analyte. The way we've done this has been the same forever, but that doesn't mean it's still state of the art. That's what they're really trying to assess here. Not everything is going to make it through the IVDR in its existing form, but that's their purpose. They want to ensure that your device performs as intended under whatever specific circumstances you're claiming. So it is possible for you to go in and say, I'm not the most sensitive test on the market, but maybe I have the benefit of being able to be used at point of care, or I can be used under these very specific circumstances, and this is where people are using my device still. That's what you need to know. And that's where that state-of-the-art search really helps you determine the strategy, and then also helps you determine if there may be any limits to your, based on changes that are necessary to your intended purpose to still be considered state-of-the-art. You may have to limit your intended purpose in order to go in as sort of a legacy device.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So with that said, we are closing in on time for today's webinar. We'll take one more question here, Lori, and then we will provide some closing remarks. So Lori, Veronica is asking us, do you see differences in requirements between notified bodies?
In our MDR experience, which is what I will reference, we work with all of the clients who we've written CERs for. Almost all of them ask us to assist them with the answering the review questions as they come back. There are 3 rounds of review that a notified body will, if necessary, conduct until all questions that they've posed are answered. So we see with many of our clients, TUV Sud, we see the responses from TUV Sud, BSI, GMed, and others. So your question is, are there differences in requirements between notified bodies? No, there aren't differences in requirements. Are there slight differences perhaps in interpretation, or they will judge, a particular notified body reviewer will judge a certain section or argument within a document as lacking or not aligned with the regulations, whereas another individual human reviewer may come to a different conclusion and find it not lacking. Of course, there's always human interpretation, of course, is a big part of this. We have found that for the most part, the notified body reviewers are sincere. They are looking to be rigorous and scientifically sound. Now, I know I preached a little bit earlier about tired, cranky, hungry, sleepy, which they are, but we have found that for the most part, based on our clients' experiences, that they do their very best. Another thing I'd like to point out, and again, this is not our role, we were the writers. It's up to us to help our clients resolve some of the issues that the notified bodies are asking about. But we have found clients push back on the notified body if they have a sound argument in which they disagree with the notified body's conclusion about something. We have found sometimes that is successful. So I'll leave you with, don't be shy with a notified body to ask for further clarification, further justification, or to produce your counter argument to why you think whatever it is they're questioning is sound and aligns with IVDR regulations.
Thank you so much, Lori. Sarah, Lori, we appreciate your time today on the presentation. I know we had a number of questions we did not have time to answer, so we will be reaching out to those who submitted them. Again, we appreciate you joining us. We're proud to announce that Criterion Edge was awarded Company of the Year by Life Sciences Review among top regulatory services companies. So how can we help you? If you have questions about your PER upcoming projects, we would be happy to book an appointment with you. And feel free to utilize the link in the chat. Lastly, if you enjoyed our webinar today, you may want to sign up for webinar notifications. You can scan the QR code on the next slide on the screen with your phone camera, or click the link that we will now send in the chat to be notified of our upcoming webinars. If you still have questions on the content we discussed today, or if you'd like to learn about our services, you can schedule a free appointment with our specialist. Again, our contact information is consult@criterionedge.com, or you can book a free consultation to get your PER for your company scoped free of charge. This webinar is recorded and will be available soon to watch on our website and send out to you in an email with the slides and all of these announcements. When you exit the webinar today, please take our short survey and let us know how you enjoyed today's talk and what other topics you would like us to cover in the future. Thank you everyone for attending and for all your questions. We hope this presentation gave you more insight into how to effectively prepare your PER and brought you one step closer to writing readiness. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.